In this video, I'll be walking through how I made an end table out of walnut and poplar that features a recessed outlet. Here's a finished shot of the table so I can explain it a little better. The base is made of poplar, has some reverse tapered legs, has some recesses that look like, kind of like drawers, they mimic drawers, and then the top is made from walnut, and you can see the recessed outlets here that will pop up to allow access to them. And here it is in its final spot in our living room. All right, let's get started here. Here's the plan. Overall, the table is 30 inches wide and deep. It's about 23 inches tall. And as I mentioned before, the base has got reverse tapered legs made from poplar that will get painted, and then the top is made from walnut. Some important details here on the mortises. Since they'll be joining at a skinnier portion of the leg, I wanted the tenons to be offset from each other so they wouldn't interfere. So you can see the B side is a split tenon, and then the C side is one large tenon that fits in the middle, but doesn't interfere with the other two, just to give me the biggest glue joint as possible. All right, I've already milled up the poplar for the legs. It started as 10 quarter stock, so nice and thick. Here I'm resawing the poplar for the aprons. All right, one important thing you never want to screw up is ensuring that you always add the length of your tenons to your cuts. So, walking through some simple math here, my desired internal dimension is 21 5/8, and each tenon is an inch, so 23 5/8 it is. Alright, then here are the 4 finished aprons, all the same size, but they will get different tenons on each end. At least 2 of them will. Here I'm just laying out the mortise locations on the legs. I've already milled the legs, cut them square, and then here I'm just laying out where the mortises are going to end up. What I didn't show on camera was that I already laid out the tenon locations on the aprons or the rails. I do that first and then just transfer those marks to the legs. This helps ensure proper alignment and also avoids a lot of any pesky math issues that may come up with adding and subtracting and things like that. So just direct part to part transfer is a little bit easier to do. I put those small little arrows on the one side of the mortise, and that helps remind me which side I should be routing from, just so I have a consistent reference point for every mortise I make. And as you saw there, I used the other leg to lay out the locations on this leg for the mortises. Doing that is just much easier than measuring it all out again and possibly making a mistake, or not on the right 16th line or whatever. So and here I'm knifing the end lines of all the mortises. Since I'll come back and square them up with a chisel, it's nice to have something to set the chisel into. Next up, I'm just using a marking gauge to mark the tenon shoulders. Now we're getting into making the mortises. I'm using a plunge router and a 1/2-inch spiral cut bit. I have this homemade router-based jig that I utilize when I'm doing this. You can see it's got 2 little wooden fences on that, and that I have both 2 legs clamped together to help with stability of the router. and then I also have it clamped to my top of my assembly table here. And then you can see I just flip the legs around. Gonna cut another one. And then from this, I'm just cutting the small mortises in this one, the two split tenon mortises. Doesn't take very long with a 1/2 inch bit since they're only 1 inch long, so it's pretty quick. During routing of the mortises, I did have 2 instances where when plunging the router into the material at the start and end, the router caught some funny grain and jumped. So I have 2 mortises that had a little bit, had some character to them, which is unfortunate, but it has happened from time to time. As I mentioned before, just squaring up the ends of the mortises here using a chisel and a small hammer. I'm not really sure why I prefer this over rounding over my tenons. I just I don't know. I guess this is what I always do, and this is just what I always do. Not sure why. After all the mortises are cut, moving on to cutting tenons, I always start with using a standard blade in my table saw, and I cut the shoulder locations of where those tenons are going to be with my regular blade, and then I switch over to a dado stack and remove the bulk of the waste. Here I am cutting the split tenons using just a pull saw to cut the tenons out, and then I'll come back with a with a coping saw and remove a bulk of the waste. If I would have had more tenons to do, I would have used a my bandsaw or something like that, something quicker. But since I only have a few of these to do, it just makes sense just set it up on the bench and take care of it. So here I'm just cleaning up the tenons, using a chisel and paring away that material. One thing I've noticed does help is putting a little bit of denatured alcohol on the end grain. Just helps with the removal a bit. I chop a little over halfway through on this side, and then what I'll do is I'll clean this side up a little bit, and then flip it over and finish chopping from the other. I did get a little bit of, I don't know if it's called like grain compression. It tore out a little bit, so after this one I did go over to my sharpening station and sharpen up this chisel a little bit. Now I'm moving on to actually fitting the tenons into the respective mortises. So using a shoulder plane with a chisel just to help clean up anything and do some test fits. So really fits right off the saw. Usually takes a couple of tries here. That one was a little tight and had a little bit of a gap to it. So clean up a little bit more material and repeat. Do some light sharpening of my chisel there with a strop. I still wasn't happy with the fit there. There was a little gap towards the bottom of the bottom of the mortise caused by a little bit of a rocking motion. All right, and it seems like I'm finally happy with this one. After all the joinery is cut, in the legs, I'm moving on to putting that reverse taper in the legs. It starts out as removing 3/4 of material from the very top, and then removing none at the very bottom, going to the edge here. So there's many ways to do this. My tapering jig wouldn't work with this thick a stock, so I went to the bandsaw and did a rough cut of the taper first. And with tapering both outside faces of the leg, I had to cut one taper, tape back on that material because that had my line on it for the next taper. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm taping that material back on. And then I'll finish cutting the second taper. One important thing to keep in mind is to always hold on to these taper offcuts. They'll come back to be useful during the glue up, and you'll see they'll make a reappearance here later on. After the bandsaw, I clean up some of the if there's like a really rough spot in the bandsaw cut that had a big jump. I used the jack plane here to clean those up and get it semi-smooth. I'm not looking for perfection here, since the next step is to take it over to the jointer and do the finish flattening over there. So got to pass through the jointer a few times on each face to clean up that surface. All right. After all the shaping's done, it's time to move on to those recesses in the aprons or the rails. I made a little jig out of some 3/4 inch plywood and Craig screws here, just to make a rectangle, and then I trace where that's going to be on the piece. Do some rough cutting with the jigsaw, and then here I'm using double stick tape to set the jig down into place. So it doesn't move while I use a router and a pattern bit or flush trim bit. I get confused of which one's which. The bearing's on top. After getting those recesses cut out in the aprons, I'm moving on to chamfering things on the router table. So I got a 45-degree chamfer bit, and here I'm doing the bottom of the legs with a heavy chamfer to reduce any chance of a tear out if it gets slid across the ground. I'm using a miter gauge just because the legs had that reverse taper cut into them, so I need to adjust the angle when I was doing that. And then I'm applying a chamfer to the inside and outside of these recesses in the aprons, just to change the look a little bit. And then after I do the routing, of course there's a rounded corner here due to the round bit, so coming back with a paring chisel and just working my way slowly into the corner. Some of these went really easy, just maybe 2 or 3 attempts with the chisel. Some of them took a little bit longer. All right, now moving on to the glue up. I did do some sanding beforehand, just didn't show it because it's kind of boring. I also routed small grooves in the aprons on the inside to accept the metal Z-clips that will attach the tabletop down the road. So this glue up went okay. One thing I wish I would have done is I wish I would have clamped these two sub-assemblies up first, because things kind of moved around a little bit and weren't in perfect position. So I should have done that, and I also should have applied more masking tape to the angled cutoffs I made with it for the tapers. Those are on there to keep the faces square, so when I apply the clamps, there's no weird angles getting compressed in there. But I should use more tape. They kept falling off. Apply some clamps and let it sit overnight. That essentially concludes the base construction. I'm now going to move on to the top, which is pretty straightforward, just a panel glue up. But I started with milling all the walnut to flat and thickness, and then here I'm ripping one side parallel to the jointed edge. After ripping these all to width, I laid them out in what I thought was a good orientation, a good layout, trying to also keep in mind the grain direction and trying to avoid cupping over time. So sitting here pondering my layout, making sure I like it. After I'm done, of course, I put a carpenter's triangle on it, and I also mark ins and outs. So when I'm passing the edges over the jointer, I can negate any angular impact the jointer fence may have, albeit very slight. Still could cause a small gap in the glue line. So in and out just reminds me which way I should have it up against the fence when I'm jointing. After I join all the pieces, I bring it back to the bench for a glue up. I still had a small gap between two boards, so I'm over at the joiner now, cleaning them up again, and then coming back and getting ready for the glue up here. All right, getting all set up. One thing I do is like to check square. Sometimes these can get a little skewed on you, and I only have about an inch of extra material in both directions, so I don't want it to be too far off. Or I have to trim off a lot of material to make it square, and then it's undersized. So grabbing some extra clamps, and now getting ready to glue up. One thing you'll notice here is I apply glue the first time and get them all situated, and then realized I might not have put enough glue on a couple of the joints, so I have to open it back up and put a little bit more glue in there. something that I've been doing recently is just applying clamping pressure here with the three parallel clamps on the bottom, and then I do like to clean out a bulk of the glue squeeze out before I apply the remaining clamps across the top side. Just kind of limits the amount of cleanup and mess I gotta deal with after the fact, because sometimes when the glue gets dry and you scrape it off, you end up pulling off a little bit of wood with it. It makes it a little bit tougher to sand the top and get nice and flat and ready for finish. After you get the clamps on the top here, just to kind of get even clamping pressure on top and bottom to avoid any cupping, I do flip it up on its end and clean off the glue squeeze out the bottom side. After the glue dries and I pull it out of the clamps, I'm coming back with a track saw here and cutting the top square as well as to width and length. And to me, this is where the track saw really shows its strength. This is a big panel. I wouldn't be able to get over my table saw and use some type of my panel cutting jig. It's just too large for that. So this is where it really shines. Alright, after cutting it to length and width, come back with the card scraper to knock down any high spots. I don't use a card scraper primarily for flattening. I just do it for the really high areas, and then I come back with each sander sitting in the background there and get this all knocked down flat and smooth. In order to put the recessed outlets in there, I followed a similar process. Make a jig that fits the recessed outlet box, trace it out, rough cut with a jigsaw, come back with a router and a pattern bit and just cut that out to fit the exact dimension of the box. I then had to use a combination of a rabbiting jig as well as some chisels to get the recessed outlet to fit in there nice. Had little tabs on the left and right hand side that it would sit on, and that's where you put the screws through to hold it to the top. So that took a fair amount of extra effort to fit that in. But alright, moving on to spraying the base here. I'm using this little handheld Graco sprayer. It was my first project using this. It worked pretty well. It does spray a lot of paint in kind of a pulsating fashion, so it just takes a little bit of time getting used to that. So I did have a few runs and sags that I had to fix between coats. But overall, it turned out pretty well. I was using latex here. I'll be switching away from that in the future, using something more alkyd based, but it worked for now. Here I am spraying the top with my HVLP and some polyacrylic. One thing I didn't mention in the video was adding a 45-degree chamfer to the underside of the top, just to give it a little bit thinner aesthetic. But here's the first coat of polyacrylic going on. And you can see my awesome spray booth in the background there with a bunch of tarps and plastic sheeting. In between coats, I'm scuffing the polyacrylic with 320 grit sandpaper and the sponge just to knock down any nibs or high spots, and then give the next coat something to grab onto. After I clean that up, it's time to move on to the next coat of polyacrylic. You can see the luster, the shine coming to the bottom of this top now with that second coat going on there. The first coat absorbs so quickly, doesn't really leave much of a shine, but I think this is actually my third coat going on at this point in time. And then the the flip right there to get both sides within the same spraying session. Somewhat dangerous, can mess up the finish, but as long as you're careful, you can flip it over. Alright, that pretty much wraps up the sequence to get the build done here. Last thing to do was to attach the top once dried to the base. As I mentioned before, I used the little metal Z-clip fasteners to do that. I think I used 8 overall, 2 in each apron. Here are some finished pictures similar to the beginning, just showing again once that reverse taper in the legs, those recesses in the aprons that kind of mimic drawer fronts visually, but lighten up the piece overall. I think the top turned out great, and the little recessed outlets really add a lot of function to this table since it's in the corner of our living room and you're not able to access the outlets easily because they're behind couches. I want to thank you all for watching. This video was kind of long, but I did get everything into one video instead of 2. So once again, thanks for watching. Please like the video, subscribe, leave comments.